somewhere along the line we're going to discover we've been had.
We don't want to be unkind, but we want to be factual. We don't want to cause hurt feelings, but we want to be academically correct in what we understand and know to be true. Christianity just is not based on truth. We find that Christianity was in fact nothing more than a Roman story, developed politically.
The reality is, Jesus was the solar deity of the Gnostic Christian sect. And like all other pagan gods, he was a mythical figure. It was the political establishment that sought to historize the Jesus figure for social control. In 325 AD in Rome, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. It was during this meeting that the politically motivated Christian doctrines were established, and thus began a long history of religious bloodshed and spiritual fraud. And for over the next 1,000 years, the Vatican maintained a political stranglehold on all of Europe, leading to such joyous periods as the Dark Ages, along with enlightening events such as the Crusades and the Inquisition. Christianity, along with all other related theologies, is an historical fraud. These religions now serve to detach the species from the natural world, and likewise each other. They support blind submission to authority. They reduce human responsibility to the effect that God controls everything, and in turn awful crimes can be justified in the name of a divine pursuit. And, most critically, it empowers the political establishment who have been using the myth to manipulate and control societies. The religious myth is one of the most powerful devices ever created, and it serves as the psychological soil upon which other myths can flourish.
What we don't find is this person who appears as some sort of spectre within that historical tableau called Jesus. He doesn't have a mark at all. Now that is a dilemma for those who believe in him, because on the one hand he supposedly overturned the world. It turned the world upside down and triggered off this massive movement, but on the other hand he leaves no trace in the historical record.
Well, Christian theologians, scholars and historians tend to rely on less evidence for proofs of their faith than for the comparative religion and mythology that I'm describing. In other words, they will dun me with requests for evidence for every single detail, as much as I can provide, mountains and mountains of it, in a variety of languages, as far back as you can get to the most modern period. And this is what I do, actually. I collected as much as I can find from around the world in as many cultures as possible, dating back as far into antiquity as we possess, all the way up to the most modern research, to show these motifs, to show these origins of various ideas that we find in the New Testament. Now, that is the burden of proof that has been requested of my particular perspective of reality, my thesis. And on the other hand, however, in order to convince themselves that 2,000 years ago the God of the cosmos came to earth through the womb of a young virgin girl of a particular ethnicity, performed miracles like healing the blind, walking on water and raising the dead, transfiguring on a mount, calming a storm, being crucified himself, obviously, and that resurrecting himself from the dead and ascending into heaven, they require, well, pretty much no proof, no evidence other than the New Testament.
This is the sun. As far back as 10,000 BC, history is abundant with carvings and writings reflecting people's respect and adoration for this object. And it is simple to understand why, as every morning the sun would rise, bringing vision, warmth, and security, saving man from the cold, blind, predator-filled darkness of night. Without it, the cultures understood, the crops would not grow, and life on the planet would not survive. These realities made the sun the most adored object of all time. Likewise, they were also very aware of the stars. The tracking of the stars allowed them to recognize and anticipate events which occurred over long periods of time, such as eclipses and full moons. They in turn cataloged celestial groups into what we know today as constellations. This is the cross of the zodiac, one of the oldest conceptual images in human history. It reflects the sun as it figuratively passes through the 12 major constellations over the course of a year. It also reflects the 12 months of the year, the 4 seasons, and the solstices and equinoxes. The term zodiac relates to the fact that constellations were anthropomorphized, or personified, as figures or animals. In other words, the early civilizations did not just follow the sun and stars, they personified them with elaborate myths involving their movements and relationships. The sun, with its life-giving and saving qualities, was personified as a representative of the unseen creator or God, God's Son, the light of the world, the savior of humankind. Likewise, the 12 constellations represented places of travel for God's Son, and were identified by names, usually representing elements of nature that happened during that period of time. For example, Aquarius, the water bearer, who brings the spring rains. This is Horus. He is the sun god of Egypt of around 3000 BC. He is the sun anthropomorphized, and his life is a series of allegorical myths involving the sun's movement in the sky. From the ancient hieroglyphics in Egypt, we know much about this solar messiah. For instance, Horus, being the sun or the light, had an enemy known as Set, and Set was the personification of the darkness or night. And, metaphorically speaking, every morning Horus would win the battle against Set, while in the evening Set would conquer Horus and send him into the underworld. It is important to note that dark versus light, or good versus evil, is one of the most ubiquitous mythological dualities ever known, and is still expressed on many levels to this day. Broadly speaking, the story of Horus is as follows. Horus was born on December 25th of the Virgin Isis Mary. His birth was accompanied by a star in the east, and upon his birth he was adored by 3 kings. At the age of 12, he was a prodigal child teacher, and at the age of 30, he was baptized by a figure known as Anup, and thus began his ministry. Horus had 12 disciples he traveled about with, performing miracles such as healing the sick and walking on water. Horus was known by many gestural names such as the Truth, the Light, God's Anointed Son, the Good Shepherd, the Lamb of God, and many others. After being betrayed by Typhon, Horus was crucified, buried for 3 days, and thus resurrected. These attributes of Horus, whether original or not, seem to permeate many cultures of the world, for many other gods are found to have the same general mythological structure. Attis of Phrygia, born of the Virgin Nana on December 25th, crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days was resurrected. Krishna of India, born of the Virgin Devaki, with a star in the east signaling his coming. He performed miracles with his disciples, and, upon his death, was resurrected. Dionysus of Greece, born of a virgin on December 25th, was a traveling teacher who performed miracles such as turning water into wine. He was referred to as the King of Kings, God's only begotten Son, the Alpha and Omega, and many others. And, upon his death, he was resurrected. Mithra of Persia, born of a virgin on December 25th, he had 12 disciples and performed miracles, and upon his death was buried for 3 days and thus resurrected. He was also referred to as the Truth, the Light, and many others. Interestingly, the sacred day of worship of Mithra was Sunday. The fact of the matter is, there are numerous saviors from different periods from all over the world which subscribe to these general characteristics. The question remains, why these attributes? Why the virgin birth on December 25th? Why dead for 3 days in the inevitable resurrection? Why 12 disciples or followers? To find out, let's examine the most recent of the solar messiahs. Jesus Christ was born of the Virgin Mary on December 25th in Bethlehem. His birth was announced by a star in the east, which 3 kings or magi followed to locate and adorn the new Savior. He was a child teacher at 12, and at the age of 30 he was baptized by John the Baptist, and thus began his ministry. Jesus had 12 disciples, which he traveled about with, performing miracles such as healing the sick, walking on water, raising the dead. He was also known as the King of Kings, the Son of God, the Light of the World, the Alpha and Omega, the Lamb of God, and many, many others. After being betrayed by his disciple Judas and sold for 30 pieces of silver, he was crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days was resurrected and ascended into heaven. First of all, the birth sequence is completely astrological. The star in the east is Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which, on December 24th, aligns with the 3 brightest stars in Orion's belt. These 3 bright stars in Orion's belt are called today what they were called in ancient times, the 3 kings. And the 3 kings and the brightest star, Sirius, all point to the place of the sunrise on December 25th. This is why the 3 kings follow the star in the east, in order to locate the sunrise, the birth of the sun. The Virgin Mary is the constellation Virgo, also known as Virgo the Virgin. Virgo in Latin means virgin. Virgo is also referred to as the house of bread, and the representation of Virgo is a virgin holding a sheaf of wheat. This house of bread and its symbol of wheat represents August and September, the time of harvest. In turn, Bethlehem, in fact, literally translates to house of bread. Bethlehem is thus a reference to the constellation Virgo, a place in the sky, not on earth. There's another very interesting phenomenon that occurs around December 25th, or the winter solstice. From the summer solstice to the winter solstice, the days become shorter and colder. And from the perspective of the northern hemisphere, the sun appears to move south and get smaller and more scarce. The shortening of the days and the expiration of the crops when approaching the winter solstice symbolize the process of death to the ancients. It was the death of the sun. And by December 22nd, the sun's demise was fully realized, for the sun, having moved south continually for 6 months, makes it to its lowest point in the sky. Here a curious thing occurs. The sun stops moving south, at least perceivably, for 3 days. And during this 3-day pause, the sun resides in the vicinity of the Southern Cross, or Crux, constellation. And after this time, on December 25th, the sun moves 1 degree, this time north, foreshadowing longer days, warmth, and spring. And thus it was said, the sun died on the cross, was dead for 3 days, only to be resurrected or born again. This is why Jesus and numerous other sun gods share the crucifixion, 3-day death, and resurrection concept. It is the sun's transition period before it shifts its direction back into the northern hemisphere, bringing spring and thus salvation.
Philistines had a god they called Dagon. From Dag equals a fish, and on equals the sun equals the fish sun, or the sun in Pisces. Just as Jesus, Ichthyes, personifies the sun in the age of Pisces. In this we see a solid connection between Dagon and Jesus, and thus, Saturn is Noah, Noah is Dagon, Dagon is Jesus, Jesus is Saturn, in layman's terms. Jordan Maxwell even pointed out, the Hebrews themselves worshipped Dagon as Noah. The mythical Hebrew male was adapted from the Babylonian account of Gilgamesh, although their Bible stated he was a Philistine god. The Christian Catholic faith today represents him and worships him as well, using the crown for their demigod the Pope. Using the ancient fish god's staff and crown, why do humans so ignorant and needy not question any of the origins of these symbolic meanings? Belus Cronus, or Saturn, he was the father of the gods, and the father of the gods was also known as Janus, who was called the god of gods, from whom the gods had their origin. Now, Ovid makes Janus say of himself, the ancients called me Chaos, and Chaos was the Greek god of confusion. Homer proclaims Janus and Saturn to be two titles of the same person. Dagon, the fish god, represents the deity Noah as a manifestation of the same patriarch who had lived so long in the waters of the deluge. As the Pope bears the keys of Janus, who was also previously shown to be Saturn, so he wears the mitre of Dagon. The two-horned mitre, which the Pope wears when he sits on the high altar at Rome and receives the adoration of the cardinals, is the very same mitre worn by Dagon, the fish god of the Philistines and Babylonians.
What is the Antichrist? Who is the Antichrist? And he said, in the Bible there's something like 17 references to the Antichrist, and the only thing on earth that currently fits all of those descriptions without missing one out is the Vatican. You know, wouldn't that be great if you were the Antichrist to come in and start off as the controller of the church that tells everybody what Christ is and what Christ teaches?
My goodness. See, the fact is, Vinny, the Antichrist is the Lord Anno Domini, and it's the calendar that is based on that Lord. They've given us a historical Lord. They claim that there was a Jesus who was born and he came to save man. He was God's son, and we date our calendar from his birth, you see. Well, it turns out the true Lord that these Anno Domini people, the Julian calendar types, Rome, turns out their Lord is actually the crown, and the crown is Kronos, and Kronos is Saturn, and Saturn is otherwise known in theology as Satan, the devil.
They're all the same cult. It doesn't make a difference who we're talking about here. You could be talking about Satanists, Setians, the worshippers of the Great Owl at Bohemian Grove, the Skull and Bones Order of Death, the cult of the Black Sun that came out of the Nazi and SS party of Germany. All right, in the modern day, they're top-level international bankers, top-level political figures, top-level financiers, high-level members of royalty, so-called royal families, judiciary, military, high-level military, people involved at highest levels of media, highest levels of medicine, highest levels of education, secret societies and fraternal orders, think tanks, intelligence agencies, you name it. This is where the highest concentration of dark occultists are at. This is who they are. This is how they operate in the world. These are the institutions who determine how people's lives will be run, because we let them. And at the top level of every one of these institutions, you're going to find the cult of the Black Sun operating.
The people who are in power in this country, the great generals from around the world who are planning wars and violence and bloodshed, all of this stuff can be traced back to the planet Saturn. Saturn was the god of darkness, chaos, and destruction.
But in 1582, Pope Gregory he took the Julian calendar. I call it the Orthodox calendar, or the calendar of the East. He took the Eastern sunrise calendar, the calendar of the day, and he changed it for their purposes. They explain it, in all different ways, that they were just trying to make it right. But Pope Gregory in 1582 created the Gregorian, or what's known as the Anno Domini calendar. That calendar is a timeline that is copyrighted by the Vatican. So imagine if September 19th, 1960, a character is born to that timeline, and let's just call that character Curtis Richard Kallenbach. That character is born into a copyrighted timeline. In other words, the Vatican has a legitimate claim upon that title, upon that name. So people don't realize it, but if you're using that Anno Domini Gregorian calendar, in other words, right now it's 2016, you're subjecting yourself to a commercial. It was created for commerce. It's called the Western calendar for a reason, or the New World Order calendar, whatever you want to call it. But it was designed to own the characters born to it. And they've created a world that is a story. Everything is within their story. I call it his story, as in history. And none of those stories, anything inside that book, can we actually claim for ourselves. They even created a character for us in their story. Let me explain that real quick. Everybody knows Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling is the author of all the Harry Potter novels. If I woke up tomorrow morning and put on the clothing, the character of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling has a legitimate claim upon everything I do by wearing that character. If I get up tomorrow morning and put on the character of Curtis Richard Kallenbach, the Vatican has a legitimate claim on all the production, all the productivity that I create while wearing the clothing of their character. People have no idea how bad or how misguided we've been. And I'm just talking very superficial. I'm talking about subject. I haven't even got into the concept of matter, i.e. subject matter. The subject is Curtis Richard Kallenbach, and that subject was born to a timeline that has a copyright, and it's had a copyright since 1582 when Pope Gregory created that world. In the beginning, i.e. Genesis, that's not the beginning of reality. I mean, that's the beginning of a story. And people don't realize it, but the Bible is a copyrighted piece of literature as well. And there's a copy hold on that piece of literature. So again, if we're choosing to live by these stories, we're going to be, well, subjecting ourselves to the stories or the copyright owner or holder of these stories. So it's pretty dangerous to believe in this kind of nonsense.
The United States has always been, and still is, a British Crown colony. King James I was famous not for just changing the Bible into the King James Version, but for signing the first Charter of Virginia in 1606. That charter granted America's British forefathers a license to settle and colonize America. The charter also guaranteed that future kings and queens of England would have sovereign authority over all the citizens and colonized land in America stolen from the Indians. After America declared its independence from Great Britain, the Treaty of 1783 was signed. That treaty specifically identifies the King of England as the Prince of the United States and contradicts the belief that America won the War of Independence.
So he wears a black robe. Black robes, most people never question, why do Catholic priests wear black robes? Kids that graduate from high school wear black robes. Judges wear black robes. Rabbis wear black robes because black robes represent the planet Saturn. They are a symbol for the planet Saturn. Saturn was called by the ancient people Lord of the Rings, and Saturn is Lord of the Rings. This is why women were told in the ancient world to listen to their god, and the concept was they would wear an ear ring. Men were to get married before their gods. They wear a wedding ring because the old ancient god of the Middle East, one of the ancient gods of the Middle East, was the planet Saturn. Saturn was directly connected to Yahweh, the Hebrew God. And so this is why even today the Jews celebrate the worship of Saturn. Saturn in the old Phoenician language was called Shabbath. Look up in the Phoenician language, you will find that the planet Saturn was called Shabbath. And his worship to honor him once a week was called Sabbath. So when the Jews are having Sabbath, they're actually paying homage to their god Saturn, Lord of the Rings. And so when you start breaking down where religions have come from, theologies have come from, the six-pointed star, for instance, is called the Star of David. Actually, it's not the Star of David. All the encyclopedias and reference works will tell you that it's called the Star of Saturn. It is a hexagram. Hexagrams represented the planet Saturn. So, and then when you look at the Christian system of things, the church is a disgrace, in my opinion, period. The Christian church is a disgrace. Everything that comes out of the Christian church in America is a disgrace. It's filled with lies, deception, innuendos. It is a money-making corporation. It operates under maritime admiralty law. And there is a whole world of knowledge that Christians have not been given
about the scriptures, about who wrote the Bible, where it came from. There's great reference books out there that tell you where things have come from. Called the dark sun, the black sun. This is what the Nazis and the SS and the Gestapo wore black. That's why priests wear black. That's why judges wear black robes. Why do you think a judge wears a black robe? He wears a black robe because when you used to graduate from university, you wear a black robe. Why black robes? Darth Vader wears a black robe. What the hell does a black robe have to do with anything? The judges wear black robes. You know, Supreme Court judges wear black robes. Black robes represent the priesthood of the planet Saturn, the Saturnalian Brotherhood. All you need to do is study Nazism, and you will begin to see that the powers behind the Nazi Party, the Thule Society, the Germanian Order, were all members of something called the Saturnalian Brotherhood, the Brotherhood of Saturn. Saturn was the god of darkness, chaos, and destruction.
It's better to lose your skull cap than your skull. The Inquisition, what a show. The Inquisition, here we go. We know you're wishing that we'd go away, but the Inquisition's here and it's here to stay.
The Inquisition swept like a plague across medieval Europe. It was without question one of the darkest and bloodiest episodes in human history. A time when thousands of people accused of heresy by the Catholic Church were arrested, tried, and put to death.
It was ethnic cleansing on a huge scale.
Is represented by a black cube. The Saturnian supreme deity ruled over the North Pole of Saturn in all civilizations. And as you could see here, the North Pole of Saturn is in a shape of a hexagon, which gives us a 3D cube. And when we look at the South Pole from a bird's eye view, we could clearly see an eye. Therefore, that is where we get the ancient term, the all-seeing eye.
According to Pope Gregory VII, the Roman pontiff alone has the authority to make and depose kings, declare religious writings as valid or invalid, and make laws. Among other things, he asserted that the Roman Church has never and will never err, that kings should kiss the feet of the Pope, and that the Pope himself is above the law and can only be judged by God himself. Pope Leo X famously said, "It has served us well, this myth of Christ." They caused the majority of the population to become illiterate and ignorant, suppressing all forms of scholarship except for within the clergy. Book banning and burning was a common practice, and the general populace was even prohibited from reading the Bible. The Vatican's methods for controlling the populace became a violent and bloody campaign for ultimate domination, eliminating anyone who disagreed with church dogma.
The English invented the name Jesus. There was no letter J before the 16th century. Jesus was changed from Latin Jesus. Jesus is from the Greek word Jesus, translated in Hebrew meaning Hail Zeus or Greetings Zeus. Sincere believers in the Jewish Messiah are very uncomfortable with the Greek word Jesus, even they see in it a very clear correlation to the Greek sun god Zeus. Compare Jesus to Er and Zeus. Er and Zeus are the same god. The first one, Er, is the Akkadian and Babylonian name for the same god in Greek named Zeus. Er is also the earlier Sumerian god known as Enki. Zeus was the head of all the Greek gods, but to the Akkadian and Babylonian people Er was simply a major deity, and to the Romans he was known as Saturn and Jupiter. That is the sun.
Let's sort out the theology/science of it all. There's no religions, okay? There's only science. In all your textbooks, whether it's the Christian Greek scriptures, the Hebrew so-called scriptures, they're all dealing with science, okay? It's called theological science, which is turned into a religion, a system. Nothing wrong with religion, but everybody's all not getting the understanding of what's exactly going on.
What's going on in theology is there is a source God, and this is the one. And this is always Christ. It's never Jesus. Jesus is never that one. Okay, Jesus is the Son of God. So when you pay attention, you get to know the archetypes and who's who. There's a one God, there's a sevenfold God, Elohim, and there's a 12-fold God, which is the noumenal, or the nous, the mind of God. Okay, the mind is connected with spirit, and it's a 12ness. The physical body is a 7ness, it's an octave. Okay, your 7 chakras, the 7 colors of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is Lucifer, which is the god of matter, which is the spectrum which is involved with what is so-called solid. Therefore, it's Satan, Lucifer. Okay, those 7. So when you're talking about 7 and 12, we're talking about soul and mind. One is spirit. The spirit is indivisible. Christ is the spirit, Krishna. Okay? So when you're talking about Jesus, Jesus can only refer to the 7 or the 12. Okay? Now, the 7 and the 12 God, the Elohim or the Cosmocrator, see there are 7 Olympians who defeat the 12 Titans. There are 7 Elohim who are in league with the 12 Adonai. You know? So what you've got is... Okay, let me read from Alvin Boyd Kuhn. I recommend everybody get this book, Who is This King of Glory? Showing how Jesus the historical is the most limited of all the Jesuses that are taught. Christ, the Spirit, Jesus represents the soul of the universe, guys, okay? It's the soul of the universe. The soul is somewhat considered inferior for some reason to the Spirit because it's partitioned into 7. And it's feminine, the Queen of Sheba, you see? Sheba means 7. The Queen of Sheba who marries Solomon is the one. The solo means one. Mono means one. Solo, mono. So the Queen of Sheba who marries Solo, mono, joins in holy matrimony because the spirit and soul are one. Okay? But the spirit is Christ. The soul is Jesus. Because Christ, God, sends forth his Son into the world. And this is why you never deny that Christ was not in the flesh. Yes, Christ was in the flesh. Not in one flesh. In every flesh. Through Jesus, the super soul, the Paramatma. Okay? And so there's a division of God into mind and soul. Mind is 12, soul is 7. So when Jesus has 12 disciples, and Satan, the ruler of 7, because that's what Satan means, Shabbat, 7, the Sabbath, we see the fight between Jesus and Satan, because Jesus, Jupiter, Zeus, has 12. That's why I pointed you to the thoracic region of the 33 vertebrae. Right in the middle, you have the 12 vertebrae called the thoracic, 4, right? Which open to the 24 rib bones, which come from 12 stem bones in the rib cage called the thoracic cage. Okay? Because Thor is always with 12. Thor and his 12 Knigets around the round table. And Saturn is the 7ness. You see, Saturn is considered more evil because it's the emotional side of the human nature rather than the mental 12ness, which is more noble and refined, you see, and is connected to the right hemisphere. You see, the right hemisphere is Abel, and Cain is the left. And see, Cain kills Abel because Cain thinks he can, but he's not able. You know, when your little child says, "Daddy, I can help you." Yes, son, you can help me, but you are not able. because sometimes in helping their fathers, they make more trouble for them. You see, so the reason Cain kills Abel is the left hemisphere must kill Abel, who is really, truly Abel. And therefore, we have this predominance of right-handed, left hemisphere, linear, male, patriarchal type of activity on the earth, where the right hemisphere connected to the left hand, which is matriarchal, which is intuition, which is God. Okay, see, the sinister, to be practicing sin means to be on the left side, sinister, and that's the left side of the cerebrum. Cerebrum means Sarah Abraham, you see, in heaven, the cerebrum. So when you go to practice sin in the left, that means you're using your left cerebrum for rational thinking only. That's sinful. You're not connecting to your right hemisphere, which is Abel, because you're killing Abel. You're a Canaanite. And so, hence you're not engaging with God and intuition and the mother. You see, God is not a boy. God is a divine couple. Radha and Krishna, Mary Magdalene and Christ. Jesus is the Son of God because it's the soul. It's either the soul or the mind, the logos. Okay, the logos is 12, the soul is 7. Let me read from Alvin Boyd Kuhn. People, this is the most important book you'll ever learn about Christ and who Christ really is. Okay, Christ is in your heart. Get to know him. Okay, Jesus is also in your heart. Jesus is called the Jiva Atma. Christ is the Parama Atma in your heart. It's 4 inches high. Synesthetic people can see it. It's the center of your aura, Taurus field. In your aura is where Christ is residing, okay? The crystal Christ of oneness. But the 7-ness of your 7 chakras and the 12-ness of the 12 cranial nerves, that Jesus, which pertains to mind, soul, and body, and not of spirit. Jesus is not of spirit. Jesus is of mind, soul, and body, which is 12 and 7, guys, okay? There are 12 systems in your body. There are 7 other systems in your body. The 7 septicana cavern, which is the cave. The 7-chambered heart, which you have in your Taurus field. Okay? Everything in the body is a 12. So let's hear what Alvin Boyd Kuhn says on page 207. In the esoteric understanding, the 12 disciples were the same in 12 aspects as the 3 kings or 3 wise men were in a 3-fold division. Or they were the same 3 powers of spirit further subdivided into 12 aspects. They were just the spiritual power and intelligence which is the Christ itself, manifesting its wholeness as a 12-part segmentation. In the same way in which the atomic force of the universe manifests a 7-part differentiation, so the spiritual nucleus of life manifests in a 12-part unfoldment. Nature sounds a 7-key octave, and the divine mind sounds a 12-key diapason. Each in its unfoldment sounds but 1 key at a time, until the succession covers the gamut. The soul advances through the scale of evolution. She passes through 12 grades of being at one time, adding unto her equipment the quality gained from experience at each level, till her absorption of the essence of all nature is complete finally in a 12-fold unity. These 12 qualities of perfected spiritual cognition are what are represented by the 12 signs of the zodiac. The suns passing successively through each sign and acquiring the special powers of each, typing the soul's round of elements and the acquisition of the 12 intelligences. In the rituals of Egypt, the soul had to pass successively through 12 dungeons, each guarded by a god, in each of which was a captive, until the door was opened by the god, who held the key and would not use it until the mortal could pronounce his name. Obviously, man is a prisoner to a faculty until he opens his ability to utilize and command its powers. Ignorance is ever the jailer, and knowledge is the only release. Inasmuch as light produced by suns is the highest aspect of creative energy, the dark dungeon was the appropriate symbol of the benighted condition of the soul when imprisoned in matter. The creative command, "Let there be light," was the divine fiat that ordered the suns to shine and the galaxies to glisten. And light in the physical area was the perfect analogue and symbol of the light of the intelligence that was to glow in the domain of ignorance, as solar light was to irradiate the universe of space. 12 lights would therefore be the most apt symbol of the 12 basic powers of divine intelligence. And this brings us back to the primal true designation of the 12 rays of genius in man, the 12 saviours of the treasures of the light. In various other symbolic typings, they were the 12 reapers of the golden grain, the 12 harvesters in the field of Amenta, the 12 builders, 12 carpenters, 12 masons, 12 potters, 12 weavers of the pattern, 12 fishermen, 12 rowers of the boat with Horus, 12 sailors in the ship of Ra, the sun. They are the 12 powers of sun god intelligence. And as ancient philosophy brings out the astounding facts that sunlight is the eventual product of divine mentation, the light of the sun is the pure energy of intellect, says Proclus in one of the most illuminating sentences ever uttered. The 12 quote-unquote rays of the solar logos become at last in men and gods the 12 faculties of spiritual intelligence and evolution, of which makes each man in his aeonial career a Christ, instructing and training his 12 disciples within the confines of his own individuality. They were the fourfold differentiation under the symbolism of fire, air, water, and earth. Of each of the three kings, or kingly powers of divine intellect, into which primordial unity of mind breaks up in its necessary fragmentation as it descends into matter. You see, this is how the Logos descends from one Christ into a divided Jesus of 7 soul and 12 mind. As water falling from the height breaks up into fragments owing to the resistance of air, and the bloodstream divides from the heart, and a tree trunk from its lower stern, so unitary intellect descending from on high breaks up into first a 3-fold partition, and finally into a 12-fold division. In reduction to simplest form, all this means that as in physical matter and its manifestation on earth, there are 4 basic differentiations of expression, as fire, air, water, and earth. And so in mind, there are 4 analogous sub-differentiations. Again, in soul, the same 4, and again, in spirit, the same 4. So, the 12 great qualities that are to divine us are the Spirit's fire, air, water, and earth. The souls, fire, air, water, and earth. And the minds, fire, air, water, and earth. All combined in one grand synthesis, the Christ consciousness. You see, Christ is spirit, Jesus is soul, and the Logos is mind. You see? And there's always a war between Satan and Jesus. Jesus, Jupiter, Jesus, normally has 12, and he's on the side of mind. He's mental and rational. And then Satan, Shabbat, he's more emotional and feminine. Oh, the woman. She's just emotional all the time, isn't she? She's always corrupting the mind. Oh, the mind of the man is more pure, isn't he? We see this is the rubbish that the theologians will not bother to explain to you. When you understand theology and science correctly and your nature, you will understand that you are the one, you are Christ, you are the seven, whether that is your satanic nature, you want to call it that, the emotional nature, go ahead. Or the 12ness of mind, and you are a rational, a God-loving, fearing, or whatever you want to call it, being. These are all God. These are all the parts of God, and these are the numbers how God, you, are manifesting in this phenomenal world produced by the causal noumenal world.